Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my April wrap-up. So these are going to be all of the books that I read in April. So last month I read 10 books in April. A lot of them were audiobooks because I was listening to a lot of books while I was doing other things. Like a lot of people, I've been cleaning a lot and decluttering and stuff during this time of isolation. So I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks while I've been doing that. And then my month overall started out really strong, and then in the middle I lost steam a little bit, but it still was pretty good. And then at the end of the month I was barely reading anything because my final project for grad school, the first draft, was due at the end of April. And so that last week I was reading pretty much nothing and just focusing on finishing that first draft. So for the beginning of May, I'm not sure how much I'm going to get read because I am still going to be working on editing and updating and everything on my drafts for my project. It is due on the 13th, I think, of May. So the first half of May is going to be probably similar to the end of April, but overall, April was pretty good. I still got a lot of reading done in the beginning of the month. So let's get started talking about the books. So first of all, I'm going to start with a series that I started and finished in April, which are the Kane Chronicles by Rick Riordan. I listened to these as audiobooks, even though I have the whole trilogy here in physical books. I've been trying to get more books off of my physical TBR, and so that means for me, I've been physically reading some of them, but then also some of them deciding that I would actually listen to them as audiobooks. And these were ones that I just thought that I would enjoy more as audiobooks, and I did really like them as audiobooks. So in the Kane Chronicles, the first book is The Red Pyramid, the second book is The Throne of Fire, and the third book is The Serpent's Shadow. And this is Rick Riordan's series that is based off of Egyptian mythology, and so we are following a brother and sister named Carter and Sadie Kane, who find out that they are related to Egyptian pharaohs and that they have connections to the Egyptian gods, which gives them certain powers. And of course they have to save the world. In this case, there is a god of chaos who is trying to destroy the world, and so it is their job to save the world from the god of chaos. And this series was really fun. I just always enjoy Rick Riordan's books. This was not my favorite series by Rick Riordan, but it also was not my least favorite from him. And even when I say this was not my favorite one, overall I just enjoy his books. They're just fun to listen to or fun to read. So even the ones that are not my favorites are still pretty good. I think I gave the first book 3.5 stars, and then the second and third book I gave each of them 3 stars. So I definitely think the first book was the strongest in the trilogy. Next, I read An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. This is an adult urban fantasy, I guess. It doesn't have a lot of the usual tropes of what I think of as urban fantasy, but it is an urban fantasy in that it takes place in modern day in New York City. So there's that. And the story follows these magical families of magicians that live in New York City, and every certain number of years they have a magical tournament to determine which family will be in charge of everything for the next, however many years until they have another magical tournament. And so in this case, they're about to have this tournament. We're following a main character who kind of came out of nowhere and has been hired by one of these magical families to represent them in this tournament. And there are kind of 3 different plot lines going on in this story. One of them is, of course, the magical tournaments themselves and the politics of everyone trying to, get on top and win these tournaments. One of them is this other plot of where their source of magic comes from and people questioning whether it's ethical where their magic is sourced from. And then there is also this kind of serial killer plot thrown in there. So there are a lot of different things happening in a very short book. Now, this is a book that I had never really intended to read, just because it doesn't sound that interesting to me. I'm not that into magical tournaments. I don't really like urban fantasy that much. It just didn't really interest me. but I decided to read it because I had seen in a few different places people saying if you liked Middle Game by Sean McGuire, then you would like An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. And so I loved Middle Game, and so anything that's compared to it, I want to at least give it a try because I loved Middle Game and I haven't found anything similar to it. So that's why I decided to give An Unkindness of Magicians a try. And I gotta say, I was not a fan of it, and I don't understand the comparison. And I think that my original assessment of the fact that this book was just not going to be for me was correct. So yeah, I just did not really enjoy An Unkindness of Magicians, and like some of it could be because of, you know, I'm not a big fan of magical tournaments. I don't really like urban fantasy that often, things like that. But there were also just things about the storytelling itself that really didn't work for me. For one thing, I think that there was too much going on in such a short book. As I was saying, there were like these 3 plot lines that were happening, and I don't think that all 3 of them should have been there. I don't feel like the serial killer plotline was really necessary. I also think there were inconsistencies in the way the magic worked. It was not like a really hard magic system, but there was some explanation as to how the magic worked in this world, and then they would do things that, from my understanding of how the magic worked, I was like, that should not work. That doesn't make sense. I also felt like there was no tension in the story. I kind of went into it expecting that this was going to be like a high stakes story because there are these magical competitions that are like to the death, and it just felt like there were no stakes, and it felt like there was no tension. It felt like everything just kind of worked out too easily. The main character could convince people of things too easily, and I think that part of that is because I think that she was too powerful, because somehow our main character is just like more powerful than everybody else, which is also something that in the magic system that they had like created doesn't make sense that she would be so much more powerful than everyone else. But you know, that's beside the point at this point. I was expecting this like high stakes, you know, tournament to the death with all of this like wild magic happening, and that is not at all what I got. Like, there was so much build up to these magical tournaments and to these magical battles, and yet every single time the battles themselves managed to be incredibly anticlimactic. And they would kind of get to the battle and be like, oh yeah, and then they like fought and this person died, and it was like, whatever, just move on. And I just expected them to be like a much bigger part of the story and to feel more important and to be like on the edge of my seat, and they were just so incredibly anticlimactic, especially with the amount of buildup that went into them, and then the actual battle just felt like an afterthought. So I ended up giving An Unkindness of Magicians 2 out of 5 stars. Then I finished Strange Grace by Tessa Gratton, which was one of my favorite books of the month, which should be no surprise to me, I guess, at this point, because Tessa Gratton is quickly becoming a new favorite author for me. This is the 3rd book I have read from her, and it's not my favorite one from her, but I've consistently enjoyed everything that I've read from her so far. So this is a YA standalone fantasy that takes place in this small village that is this very idyllic setting, but next to this village there is a forest, and the people in the village have made a deal with the devil that lives in the forest that every 7 years when the slaughter moon rises, they will sacrifice their best boy to the forest and the devil that lives in the forest. And in return, the devil protects their village. So no one ever really gets sick or injured, or if they are injured, it heals almost immediately. No one dies except from old age. And it's just this very like perfect, idyllic setting that of course they got for a very dark price. And we're following 3 main characters. So Mare, or I think her name is Merwin, is the daughter of the local witch, and in this setting the witch is actually very revered because they're the ones who kind of manage this deal with the devil throughout like the generations, because this arrangement is actually like a few generations old. Then we're also following, I never know how to say his name, if it's pronounced Run or Rune. It is R-H-U-N. I pronounced it Rune just because they talk about running a lot in the book, and so it just seemed weird to say his name was Run when they would say like Run is going to run the forest. So in my head I pronounced his name Rune. Rune is the one that everyone believes is going to be sacrificed to the forest because he is what everyone believes is the best boy. He is just very good-natured and confident and friendly and, you know, athletic and attractive, and everybody loves him. And then we also have the character Arthur, who is very angry and prickly and really feels like he has to prove himself, and he actually wants to sacrifice himself to the forest and wants to prove that he is the best boy. And the three of them are all friends, and they're all kind of in love with each other, and there is sort of a polyamorous relationship that develops over the course of the book. So as I said, this is the third Tessa Gratton book that I have read, and from having read a few of her books, I think that there are definitely some like character archetypes and certain character relationships and dynamics that she consistently likes to write about in her books. So there are a lot of similarities, I think, in the types of characters and relationships that they have in like all three of the books that I have read from her. And, you know, for me, I think that works because she likes writing these characters. I like reading about those types of characters. I enjoy the same type of like character tropes that she likes to write, and so it just really works for me. I think that in this one, the characters are not like the most well developed or the deepest characters, which is kind of interesting having this to compare to the other books I've read from her, because I think in like the Queens of Innisleer, for example, she does a really great job of creating these very deep characters, and these ones definitely felt more surface level. That being said, since these are so similar to other characters that she has written, I felt like I already knew these characters, and since they're character types that I enjoy, I just enjoyed them a lot. So I still really liked these characters, even though I do feel like they were written in a more surface level way. But I can definitely see why for other people it just might not work as well. It just happens to work really well for me. Something else that Tessa Gratton clearly loves to write and that I love to read about are like magical forests. And she does really good like nature atmosphere and, you know, forest atmosphere. So I feel like the atmosphere and the like dark nature magical vibes of this were really great, and I loved them. I love an atmospheric read. And you know, I loved like the little bit of darkness that this had. I loved the weirdness of it. There was definitely some like weird stuff that they encountered in the forest. And you know, it's not the darkest book ever, but it had just enough of that like weirdness and darkness to it to make it like delicious, and I adored it. I definitely would put content warnings on this though for human sacrifice, torture, self-mutilation, and death of a parent, along with probably a lot of other things, but those are the ones that I specifically like noted. It was a very weird book to read. I think it's not one that would work for everyone, but it really worked for me. Like, reading this book, the best way I can describe the reading experience is like a nightmarish fever dream. And I loved it. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I listened to the audiobook of The Deep by River Solomon, and this is a novella that is about the descendants of pregnant African slaves who were thrown overboard into the ocean, and their children became mermaids, pretty much. And to deal with the trauma that they have gone through, they came up with this system of having one designated historian who holds all of the memories of the community, and so that the other people in the community, or the other mermaids in the community, don't don't have to deal with the trauma on a day-to-day basis. And then once a year or every 2 years, the historian shares these memories back with the community so that they can reconnect with their past and have that sense of shared identity. And so we're following a main character who is the current historian, and it is time to share these memories back with the community. But when they do so, the main character then disappears and kind of runs away because it is such a burden to hold these memories alone all the time. And so this book is really about the importance of memory and community and this collective memory and how it affects individual identity and connection to your past. So this is one that I wasn't sure if I was going to read it or not. I had been kind of looking at it for a while because there are some things that I thought sounded interesting and some things that I wasn't so sure I would like. Mainly, I thought it sounded interesting because it deals with memory, and recently I have gotten really interested in books that deal with memory and how it affects our identity and just so many aspects of our lives. So I thought that sounded really interesting. But I also know that I don't like mermaids and I don't really like ocean settings, so I just wasn't sure if I was gonna like this book or not. And I think that for me, I think both things ended up being correct in how I felt about this book. I did think that the exploration of memory and identity and that collective memory was really interesting, and I think that it was really well done. I also just did not enjoy the mermaids or the ocean setting of it or the ocean atmosphere. Those parts of it just didn't land for me. I think that for other people who, you know, just feel more neutral about ocean settings and mermaids, or even people who enjoy ocean settings and mermaids, that part of the story might land for them a lot better than it did for me, and that is very much personal preference, that I just know I don't like mermaids. But I think that what the book was trying to do in its exploration of memory and identity and all of that, it did very well, and I thought that was really interesting and really well done. But the reason I decided to read The Deep, even though I wasn't really sure if I was going to like it, was because I wanted to read it during Passover, which was towards the beginning of April. Because Passover is also a lot about collective memory and holding those collective stories as a community and how those have informed our identity as a community. Because the Passover Seder, we retell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and the mitzvah of the Seder, so mitzvah kind of means like good deed, so the mitzvah of the Seder is retelling that story. And Passover is actually one of the few holidays that's actually like in the Torah, and it specifically says you will tell this story to your children. And there are specifically parts of the Seder where we say, when God brought me out of Egypt, it is specifically framed that I am not separate from this story and this experience, and as a part of this community I also hold this experience and this story. So that was why I really wanted to read The Deep during Passover, and I'm really glad that I did, because I do think that thematically it, you know, had a lot in common with the Passover Seder. So I really enjoyed that element of it. And something that I thought was really cool and I wasn't expecting is that at the end of the book there's an afterword where they actually talk about how they also think of this story as being kind of like a Passover Seder. So I just thought that was really cool that they had a similar feeling about it. After The Deep, I read The Mythic Harp by Sarah Jane Williams, which is a nonfiction book about harps. So this is a very short book. It's like 70 pages, and a lot of those pages aren't even text because there are a lot of pictures. There's actually sheet music in this. This is a book that I recently found because I have been like decluttering and everything, and I found some nonfiction books that I had forgotten about. I think my mom gave this to me like a very long time ago, and I just never got around to reading it, and it's so short that I decided that, you know, I should finally just read it and see what it is. And, you know, it was okay. I don't have a lot to say about it. I I don't know, it was fine. I don't think I gave it a rating because it was so short, but I was like, it was fine. Next I listened to Storm of Locusts by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is an adult kind of like urban post-apocalyptic fantasy. It's not exactly urban fantasy because it's not really in an urban setting, but it has a lot of the like urban fantasy tropes to it, so it feels like an urban fantasy. This is the second book in the, what's it called? The Sixth World series. The first one was Trail of Lightning, and I have been meaning to get to this for a while and just haven't gotten around to it. I decided to listen to it as an audiobook, which I really liked the audiobook. I would definitely recommend listening to the audiobook of this. In this, once again, we're following Maggie, who is a monster hunter. Some time has passed since the events of the first book, and we get to kind of catch up with some of the old characters. There are some new characters introduced, but in this, Maggie finds out about a cult that is called the White Locust that is maybe kidnapping people. And so she and some of her friends, some of them are friends, some of them are just people she's traveling with, set out to find out who the White Locust is and maybe save some of the people that have been kidnapped. I really liked catching up with these characters and seeing how the characters have grown or changed. I do feel like in this one, Maggie definitely is like growing as a character, which I appreciate. And I just had a really fun time with this. I feel like there was a lot of like action in it. I just wanted to keep listening. I didn't want to put it down. A lot of times the way I listen to audiobooks is like, if I'm doing something else, then I'll just kind of turn on my audiobook when it's convenient for me. But this was one that I would just like find things to do, or I would just play like games on my phone so that I could keep listening to this because I was just having such a good time. So yeah, I think that the pacing for this overall was really good and I just wanted to keep reading it, except for at the end, I felt like it was a little too fast. I felt like it wrapped up and ended a little bit too quickly for my taste. I would have liked a little more information, be a little more drawn out. I wanted a little more information on the cult leader and the whole cult situation, but overall I had a really good time with this one. I would put content warnings on this for threat of rape, violence of course, and also like a lot of insects. There's a lot of stuff with locusts in this, so there's that. But overall, I gave this one 4 stars, had a really fun time with it. Next, I listened to the audiobook of Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. This is the first book in a YA duology. Personally, I felt that it actually felt a little more like it was middle grade than YA, but in this we were following Sunny, who was born in New York City but now lives in Nigeria with her family, and she finds out that she might have some special powers, and she kind of joins this group of kids who are learning how to use these special powers. So I feel like most of the storyline is about Sunny being introduced to the magic of this world and the culture of these magical people, because she didn't previously know about them. But then there is also this plot of like a ritual serial killer who's kidnapping and killing children, and she and her friends then have to hunt down and stop this ritual serial killer. So I read this because I loved the Binti trilogy by Nnedi Okorafor and I wanted to read something else from her. And I did enjoy this. I think that the setting and the magic of this were really interesting and I enjoyed those a lot. I don't have any notes on this book apparently, because I was listening to this during the week of April when I was working on my capstone project, and so my whole brain was really focused on that, and apparently it did not occur to me to take notes during that time. So I don't have a lot to say about this one. I did enjoy listening to it. It was fun. I don't feel like my attention was fully on it because it was during that period of time when all of my brain pretty much was on my capstone. But yeah, I had a fun time reading this. I might continue the series. I haven't really decided yet. And then the last book that I finished in April, which I technically finished on May 1st, but I read most of it in April, so we're counting it, is Lady of the Forest by Jennifer Robertson. So this is sort of a Robin Hood retelling. I went into it thinking it was a Robin Hood retelling, and it's not exactly. It's a Robin Hood prequel, because it is following all of these characters and events that kind of leads them to becoming outlaws. But it's not about the point at which they are outlaws in Sherwood Forest. So really, it's a prequel. In this, we're following multiple perspectives. The main perspective is Maid Marian, but we're also following Robert of Locksley, so Robin Hood's perspective. We get Prince John, the Sheriff of Nottingham, Guy of Gisborne, a lot of other perspectives as well. That was one thing, is that I felt like this had too many perspectives in it, and it changed perspective with no warning. There was no indication when you were about to get a new perspective, so sometimes it was very jarring when it would change perspective. I also didn't care about a lot of the characters and a lot of the perspectives in this, especially like Prince John, the Sheriff of Nottingham, like so many of those things. I just didn't care about them, and I didn't need those parts of the story. It just didn't feel relevant or interesting. So I think that those could have been cut out. Really, I think a lot of this book could have been cut down, because it's like a 600-page book. Not that much happens. It really didn't need to be this long, and I got really tired of reading it. To be totally honest, I did skim parts of this. I read the first half of it, so like the first 300 pages, like I read those normally, but once I got halfway through and realized that this was the story, it wasn't going to change, and like not that much was going to happen, I started skimming the parts that were like the Sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John, because they weren't relevant and they were so boring. There were definitely some content warnings for this that I would want to mention, including sexual assault, threat of rape, anti-Semitism, suicidal ideation, and PTSD. There are a lot of like PTSD flashbacks in this. I think this book just like really wasn't what I was expecting it to be, because one, I was expecting it to be more of a romance based on the cover art, and also the fact that the back says, Robin Hood and Maid Marian, their love has belonged to the legend for centuries, and now it belongs to us all, stunningly brought to life by the masterful pen of a truly gifted storyteller. Like, that just sounds like it's going to be about their romance, but it really isn't. Like, there's very little build up to their romance. They spend barely any time together until they like have sex, and then suddenly they're in love. And I just was like, if it's gonna be about their romance, then make it about their romance. Take out all the boring parts about the Sheriff of Nottingham and like Prince John, and actually focus on the relationship of the two main characters. But also, when I read this book, I came here for the forest vibes and the outlaw shenanigans, and I got neither of those things. They spent barely any time in Sherwood Forest. There was no point at which they were living in the forest, and they were pretty much never outlaws. There was like maybe 30 pages of the book where they were actually outlaws. I just didn't get any of the things that I was expecting or wanted out of this. There were also just like a lot of things about this that were real like weird and had me just going like, why did that just happen? So I feel like I might have to do a full review for this, just to talk about some of the other stuff that happened in it. But I gave this 3 stars. It might be more like 2.5 stars. So those were all of the books that I completed in April. Then I had 2 DNFs this month, which I was very surprised by both of them. The first one was Spindle and Dagger by J. Anderson Coates. I actually just recently hauled this one and read it almost immediately, but decided to DNF. I don't actually remember how far I got. I think I got like 160 pages into it. And then the other one that I DNF'd was The Wildwood by Charles DeLint, which I got, how far? I got like 130 pages into this, and it's only like 200 pages, so like I didn't even have that much more to read, but I just so much didn't want to read it that I DNF'd it. And then of course, to end on a more positive note, the books that I'm currently reading, I'm still technically reading Enchanted Hunters by Maria Tatter. I haven't made a lot of progress on this yet. And I also am still reading The Unspoken Name by A.K. Larkwood. I haven't made much progress on this one either. But the books that I am more actively reading, I just started Wolf Speaker by Tamara Pierce. This is a reread for me. It's the second book in the Immortals Quartet, which is my favorite series in the Tortall world by Tamara Pierce. And then I also am listening to the audiobook of Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. So that is all for my April wrap-up. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!